皆様、こんにちは。本日はアメリカ大使館主催の英語教授法オンライン研修にご参加いただきありがとうございます。Good evening, everyone. My name is Grace Choi, and I'm an American diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo working on education and exchanges. I'd like to welcome you to today's teacher training session with Jenny Selvidge titled How to Assess Speaking and Writing. Jenny is joining us today from Kansas City, Missouri in the United States. She is a TESOL expert and served as the State Department and U.S. Embassy Tokyo sponsored English Language Fellow from July 2019 to March 2020, and was embedded in the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education. While here, she provided training to Japanese teachers of English and JET teachers. She is currently teaching ESL classes at Kansas University. Under the circumstances caused by COVID-19, the U.S. Embassy Tokyo has been providing virtual teacher training seminars by covering various TESOL topics. I hope you will find this online teacher training useful in your teaching and that we see you again next time. Thank you and enjoy today's session.
Konbanwa. It's good to be with you, and thank you for coming on a Friday evening to a webinar. I know that you probably have had a very busy week, and so I appreciate you taking the time to be with us this evening. Tonight's topic is how to assess speaking and writing. Assessment is such a large topic. We could talk about it for a whole weekend at a seminar. So a 45-minute presentation is only going to touch upon a few areas, but I hope that it's something that will be useful for you. As is always the case, I will give you ideas and strategies that you then need to take and think about and apply to your own situation. And so I hope that you will have some good ideas from this presentation. So, this is not working. Okay, so today's webinar, we will discuss first the role of assessment in an English classroom, which will definitely then move into the topic of formative assessment, which is so critical for an English classroom. Then we'll talk about a few ideas of how to assess speaking and writing more formally. We'll talk about rubrics, and we'll talk about rubrics in a teacher-centered classroom. So the role of assessment in an English classroom. So what is the role of assessment? It's a huge, huge part of the class itself. And my thing is not working. Okay, so assessment becomes a tool that provides feedback. This is the main aspect of assessment that is so useful, the feedback that it gives us. It provides feedback to the learner and the teacher about the suitability of the curriculum and instructional materials. So we will know, how is the curriculum doing? Is the curriculum suitable or not? Are my materials that I use in class appropriate? Are they doing what I want them to do? It also gives us feedback about the effectiveness of our teaching methods. Is how I'm teaching really effective in helping my students to learn what we need them to learn? And then, of course, what is always true, and I think we know very well, is it tells us the strengths and weaknesses of the students. So it really tells us a lot and gives us very useful feedback to both the learner and the student. And ultimately, if you bring it down very simply, assessment helps us make decisions. And I'll talk more about this. And also, it has to be closely related to instruction. Assessment isn't just one thing by itself. Assessment has to go together with how we use instruction in our classes. So we need to talk about formative versus summative assessments. When we think of summative assessments, this is what we are very familiar with tests. So the typical traditional tests, those are examples of a summative assessment. These come after learning, and it determines what have the students learned, right? So we do some teaching and then we have a test at the end. We know, okay, they are good at this and they haven't quite gotten that. So the entrance exam is a summative assessment. Unit tests are summative assessments. These are often graded or scored in some way. And we think of this as assessment of learning. What have they learned? There is nothing wrong with summative assessments. They are useful. I use them. They are helpful for giving us important feedback. They help to keep students motivated to study. So there is definitely a time and place for summative assessments. But as we move into more student-centered classrooms, and English classrooms and all classrooms really, no matter if you're teaching science or math or anything, we need more data. We need more feedback earlier on. If we only wait until the end to know if our students are learning, we have missed opportunities to help our students better equip them to reach our goal. So that's where formative assessments come in. This happens during learning. So it happens as we go through our instruction, not just at the end. So during learning. And it helps us to determine students' abilities as we're going on. How are they doing with what I'm teaching them? These don't have to be graded. These could just be useful information for us. You can grade them if you want to, or you could just do them ungraded. And we consider this assessment for learning. So assessment provides feedback, as we talked about. So that assessment helps me know how to better teach and prepare the students as we're going along. As I said, there is a time and place for both of these. One is not better than the other inherently. You know, there are times when one is better than the other, but we need to think about how we're going to do this. And as I'm guessing is true for many situations in your Japanese classrooms, I'm guessing that there's more summative assessments happening. So this is something to think about, how to slowly, incrementally add more formative assessments into your practice. So we think about what is the assessment cycle of formative assessments. So our cycle begins with planning. We plan, we then instruct, we teach our students, then we do some formative assessments, and then we look at the feedback that we get from those assessments, and we reflect on what that information is telling us, and then we go right back into planning again. So this cycle happens continually throughout our teaching. Okay, it just goes round and round. And so this is what we need to be thinking about as we assess. So let's go through each of those steps. So planning, what is your goal? We think of this as, what is your learning objective? So your can-do statements. What is the goal? A lot of times as teachers, we might just teach the textbook and we're not aware of what our learning objective actually is. So we have to start with our goal. And then we work backwards. So we need to use some backwards planning where we start with the objective and then we design our lessons and activities and assignments to reach that goal. Okay, so we have to start with planning. And then we instruct. We have to think about what teaching style, what teaching method we're going to use. And throughout this step, we are noting, we're paying attention to how students are responding to the ways and to the material that I'm giving them. If there is an ALT in the room, this is where you can really have a partnership and say, okay, we're going to try this today. I'd like you, ALT, to really be paying attention to whether students are getting it or not. And so you can really be a team as you note students' responses. So the formative assessments, these are a few examples of what we mean by that. So asking comprehension questions, which you might already do, that's a formative assessment. A grammar or vocab exercise, so homework can be a formative assessment. Pair work, group work, you can get a lot of feedback when you pay attention to how students are engaging with one another. A student presentation is also one. Writing tasks, so when you ask them to write a paragraph, that's a formative assessment. As long as you're doing it during learning and using that feedback, to help you make decisions about the next step. So I'll give you an example from this week in my class. One of my classes is a lower level writing and grammar class. And they were doing the present perfect, which is my favorite tense to teach because it's so nuanced and there's a lot in it. But this was my students' first time looking at the present perfect. And I gave them a grammar homework from Azar. It was a very typical Azar, if you know that book, grammar homework lesson. And so I looked at how they did, and they all did terribly. They all did so terribly, which was great information. That was so helpful to me because I realized, okay, if everyone is struggling, that means I need to take responsibility of that and go back and reteach it. And so I used that homework assignment, that grammar homework, to go back in my next lesson, retaught everything to help them understand what they weren't understanding. Okay, so homework assignments, little grammar exercises, things that aren't, extremely, what you might not think of student-centered, these are all formative assessments. We just have to kind of rethink how we use it and what we do with the data that it gives us. Okay, then we move into the reflection step. How are they doing? Are they meeting the objectives? Based on my homework assignment that I gave my students, they weren't doing well. They were not going to meet the objective of learning how to use the present perfect tense. So I answer the question, yes, I need to spend time reteaching something. So I cannot plan everything out so rigidly because I need to be able to adjust and make changes to my lesson planning based on the feedback that I get. Did the activities work well or not, and why? Are some students moving faster than others? So if half of my class, let's say hypothetically, did well on the homework and half didn't, then I need to make some choices about how to differentiate my instruction. Okay, so the reflection, there's so much you can think about because it's about making decisions. So then after that, I return to planning and I go back through the cycle again. What do my students need next based on the feedback I got from the formative assessments? What's really important is to use frequent checks for understanding. I have used this question. Teachers around the world, we all use this question. Do you understand? And no matter what country you're teaching in or what your students are doing or how good they are at English, they will always say, most of the time, they'll say, yes. Do they understand? We don't know. Because students may they don't want to admit they don't understand, or they just want to move on. Maybe they don't really care enough to tell you, no, I don't understand. Please teach me again, teacher. So I would really encourage you, and me, I need to also do this, is to avoid this question. This is a yes or no question, and it doesn't give us any information. Do you understand? Yes. They might not understand at all. So we need other ways to check for understanding. So like I said before, comprehension questions are really good. And I'll go through each of these in more detail in the next slide. Hand signals are my favorite. Of course, depending on the country, some hand signals are better than others, but thumbs up, you can hold up your fingers, and I'll explain that in a minute. That gesture really gives me some information as well. Warm up or exit tickets, and personal whiteboards. So let's go through each of those in one by one. So comprehension questions, you're going to ask content questions. So these are our WH questions: what, where, when, why, how, especially the why or the how. Some are better than others with the WH questions to determine whether our students are learning. So with the present perfect, I might just quickly ask my class, what is one thing you've never done? And I want them to respond in a complete sentence. How long have you been in middle school? Have you ever wanted to be famous? Why or why not? And I'm listening for how they're responding. They don't really know they're being assessed, but I'm asking my class, all the students, these questions, and based on what they say, I think, okay, they got it. They got the present perfect, or, ooh, no, they're missing the past participle form. So even though it seems like, oh, we're just talking, we're just asking questions, I am really critically thinking about what they're saying. Okay, so comprehension questions. This is why we really want to have a classroom where there is dialogue and back and forth between the teacher and the student. Okay, the hand signals is something that I really love and I use a lot in my classroom. So you could use the thumbs up or down or to the side. So I might ask them, how well do you understand what we talked about today? It's not a yes or no question. I'm asking for a thumb. And a lot of it, I like to give them the option of going however they want to. So a lot of times they'll give me a thumb in the middle. That means I kind of understand. Or even like a little bit up, that means I'm close to understanding, but not. This works really well. And they can do it privately, so they're not really showing everyone in the class, I don't get it. They can do it close to them, so it's kind of private. This also works well on Zoom. If you are on Zoom, of course, if you have a lot of students, it's hard, but if you have help, if you have an ALT, maybe they can help you to monitor those responses. But it's worked really well for me. It gives me a lot of data. I can just scan and say, okay, most people are at this, so I just need to keep going. You can also hold up fingers. Maybe 1 is I don't understand, 5 is I got it, no problem. So you can ask them, how do you feel about it? You could say, oh, I feel this is about a 3. Okay. This works so well for me. And so this might be something that could work for you as well. Personal whiteboards. So this is, a little whiteboard that each student has and they can write on it. So you can ask a question or give them a task. They can write their answer and hold it up and show it to you. So this determines whether they're learning what you intended. You don't have to buy those personal whiteboards for all 40 of your students. You can use it with the plastic sleeve, for a notebook and put a piece of paper in it and you can wipe it off. So this is also a really helpful way to assess what they're learning. And then the last one I'll talk about is warm up or exit tickets. So what this essentially is asking them a question or giving them a task to do, something short and quick. You could do it at the beginning of class. So maybe what do you remember from yesterday? Or you want to see how they're doing with something you talked about in the last class. You give them a question, they write on it, and they give it to you. Very commonly, we use this as an exit ticket at the end. So at the end of your class, you have them respond to something, they give it to you on their way out, and then you can quickly see how they're doing. You can do this digitally. A lot of places like Summative and Flipgrid, you could use it digitally, or you could do it on a piece of paper. So if I'm doing the present perfect, maybe I want to ask them to give me a statement, a question, and a negative. So this gives me a lot of information. So she said, I have go to Sapporo 2 times. I'm going to ignore the 2 times. That's not important to me right now. Have you ever go to Sapporo? I have never visited the USA. So this tells me she does not understand the use of the past participle. So I can make some decisions from this. My options, if everyone's ticket had a lot of these problems with the past participle, then I know I need to reteach to the whole class. If Famika is the only one that struggled with this, then I can pull her aside, or the ALT can pull her aside and say, okay, I think we need to go over the past participle again. Let's look at that 3rd form again, and you can help her individually. You can give more examples, you can give more practice. So this helps give me a lot of information with this exit ticket. And you can do whatever you want for an exit ticket. Whatever you think is going to help you know what you want to know, whether they're understanding or not. So the formative assessments, what you learn from these activities helps you know how to make decisions about the next step. So again, this is really rethinking how we view assessment. If you're wanting to know how to give a test or how to do this or that, I'm urging you to think differently about how you view assessment. and you need to try to incorporate it more earlier on in your teaching and as they are learning and as they're going along. Okay, so a lot of you, I think, just want to know, how do I assess speaking, right? And so a lot of these things we talked about before are assessments of speaking. So if you ask a comprehension question, or if you ask something in class formatively, they don't know you're assessing them, but you are. But I'm going to talk about a more formal way to how to assess speaking. So we need to have some steps. We need to ask ourselves some questions of how to assess. So the first question is, what is my speaking objective? That's my first place to start. And then I need to ask, what method will I use? What's most efficient and effective? So what is very important, especially for Japanese teachers, if you have a large class size, you need to really think critically about what's going to be easiest for me with my time, but will also be effective in assessing the student. Okay, so if you have a big, long rubric and you have 40 students and they're each writing a 5-page paper, you need to think a lot about what's realistic in grading. Okay, so that is one thing you must think about. And then what's very critical, how will you know if students have met the objective? So you need to break it down into pieces. How will I know if they've done this well? And then what rubric will you create to measure this? So these are my 4 guiding questions when I think about creating an assessment. So I went to the global scale of English. If you've been to my webinars before, I've mentioned this in the past. The global scale of English is such a useful tool to give me can-do statements that are according to the CEFR. And so I just went to the global scale of English, the GSE, and I found this speaking objective. It's an A2. Can describe their daily routines in a simple way. Okay, so my first question is, what method will I use? And so I need to think about what's fast, simple, clear, and effective. And it needs to be clear to both the teacher and the student. The student needs to know what's coming. They need to know how they will be assessed. So I'm going to do a short one-on-one interview. I'm going to pull students out one by one, and my ALT will also do that. Or if I don't want to do that, I can do a recorded video on Flipgrid. That is really helpful. Even if you're in person, you're not online, use Flipgrid in your class if you can, because then everybody just records a video, they send it to you, and you can look at them at home. Okay, so Flipgrid is really useful for making it effective and fast and easy on you. So I'm going to give them oral feedback in person afterwards, and I'm also going to use a rubric for written feedback. This is a very important step. How will I know if they mastered the objective? So I need to break down my objective into pieces. So to describe their daily routines in a simple way, they need the correct use of time order words. First, next, after that, finally. They need appropriate vocabulary for routines, like wake up, breakfast, get dressed, school, dinner, homework, brush my teeth, bed, and you could add more. And then I have to think about the grammar. They need to use the simple present tense for this because it's a habit, it's a routine. And they need complete sentences. So these are the things I'm looking for when I create my rubric. Rubrics are tricky. There are hundreds of types of rubrics. If you Google rubrics, you will get so many, and it's always changing what people say is a good rubric. What a good rubric is what works for you and what works for being effective for your needs and your students. So this is one example. So I have my criteria on the left. I have time order words, and I can use first, next, after that, and finally. Vocabulary can accurately use a daily task vocabulary, and then the grammar, I have it there as well. So I have 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, and 3 are my main ones. 4 is they've gone above and beyond. So if you look at the bottom of this rubric, a 1 is the criteria was not met. A 2 was partially met. 3 is they got it. 4 is they went beyond. Sometimes you'll use 4, maybe sometimes not. So basically, I just put a check mark under the number, and then I give some feedback. The feedback is really important. So you can look and see what I've done. Like in the first one, they got a 2. So I said, you used first and finally well, but let's talk about how to use next and after that. You struggled with those. And then in grammar, they got a 2. Most of your sentences had a subject and verb, and almost all of your verbs were in the right form, but you used a couple of past tense verbs, and that's not right. What's important about the feedback is that this does not have to be done in Japanese. If the students are not terribly fluent in English, you want the feedback to really help them. And so do it in Japanese if you think they will understand it better in Japanese. If your students are really fluent in English, then do it in English, but don't feel like you have to do that in English if you would rather not. So this is one version of this. Instead of numbers, you can give emoji, especially if you're in elementary, as long as they know what the emojis stand for. Okay, so if you establish at the beginning of your year what these emojis mean, then maybe this would be a good way to assess them. The feedback was the same, but you can make it fun. You can make it silly. You could do whatever you want for those. This is another type. This is more narrative. So as you look at this, clearly you can see there's a lot of words on the rubric. So you need to decide, is this amount of words going to hinder the students from really reading it? So I would urge you to think about whether this is best for you and your students, because you want the rubric to be accessible to your students, and they need to be able to read it and understand it well. So this is great if your students are more high level, but really do think about whether this works for you in your context. So here, what I did was I just put a narrative comment for the 1, 2, 3, and 4 for each criteria. So for time order, a 1 is you didn't use any time order words correctly. 2, you used some correctly. 3 is my standard, they've met it. They used them all correctly. 4, they used all of the words we talked about, and they used some other ones that I didn't. So they went above and beyond that. And so you can see that a 1 explains clearly why they didn't meet it. A 2 gives explanation of why they kind of met it, and so on. So what I would do is I would have this, printed, and then I would have a blank space for my feedback, but I would just highlight the one that they got. So they got a 2 in time order, a 4 in vocabulary, and a 2 in grammar. And my feedback was the same. So this is another option. Remember that the best rubric is the one that works for you and your students. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of this process with writing. So again, you have to think about these guiding questions. What's my objective? What is most efficient and effective? How will I know? And what rubric will I use? Same questions that guide me in my assessment creation. Okay, so I again went to the Global Scale of English and I found this B1 writing task. Can paraphrase short passages in a simple fashion using the original order of the text. So what method will I use? I'm going to assess their written summary after one previous draft. It's always more helpful if they've gone through a draft and we've gone through improving that draft, and then I have a higher level product with a second draft. So I would do a written summary after they've already done a previous draft. We're going to grade it. I'm going to grade it as a teacher, and also the ALT that works with me is going to help. When you do this, you need to calibrate. And I can talk about calibration another time in more detail, but if you have a rubric created, then together, if you're both grading, you go over a couple of samples and you talk about how you would grade it, and you calibrate is what we would call for this to see that you're on the same page of what you think a 2 is, what you think a 3 is, and so on. And then I'm going to grade it with a written rubric. So again, I think this is such a critical part of the process. How will I know if they've mastered the objective? So I break down the task. So a paraphrase includes all the major details, but no minor details. And it has them presented in the same order as the text, which is in the objective. You can choose whatever you want for grammar. For me, at a B1 level, I would probably just say that I don't want any of your mistakes to impede understanding. I don't think a perfect grammar product is realistic. They will make errors, especially students in Japan will make errors with articles and plurals. That will be true even if they're a high level. So I'm just going to grade the grammar so that any mistakes don't impede understanding. If they make some mistakes and I cannot understand their sentence, then that's significant and they will have points taken off for it. You could choose something else. You could maybe just choose that all of their verb forms are correct. I wouldn't ever just say all grammar is correct because that's too much to ask and it's too much for you to grade. And then for paraphrase, I have to think about plagiarism. So all sentences were in the student's own words. They can't copy anything from the original source. So those are the pieces that I'm looking for when I create my rubric. So this is another version. It doesn't have that fourth column. So in bold, that is the standard that I expect if they are to meet the criteria. So all important points from the source are included, no minor details are included, information's in the same order, grammar's understandable, all words are from the student. And then they start at 3. So you start by talking about what a 3 is, and then they can move down. Okay, you're going to get a little bit taken off if you include some unnecessary information or a few minor details or some ideas are in the wrong order. And then they can move down and see, oh, if I do many unimportant details or few details, major details included, that's a 1. So you can start with a 3 and then move down. And then there's room for feedback. Again, there are so many different versions of rubrics that these are just a few examples. So you need to choose what's best for you. So there is no perfect rubric. I've been making rubrics for many, many, many years, and I have never used a rubric that I have been 100% happy with. It's a fluid, dynamic tool, and so you will always be tweaking it, adjusting it. So there's no perfect rubric. What's important, like I've said, is that you need to find a system that works for you and your students. What I do urge you to do is to try to make them simple and straightforward. That helps you and it helps the student. And what's also very important is that you teach the rubric before the assignment. Don't just give it to them at the end. So don't just return it and say, oh, this is the first time I've seen the rubric. Show them the rubric before they do their assignment. Talk about it in class. Go through what the expectations are. They need to know how to use the rubric and how to interpret the rubric before they do it. And then, I'm sure I'm going to get the question, tell me what rubric to use. You need to just start Googling some rubrics because it depends on your context. It depends on your students. It depends on their goals, their needs. There are so many rubrics out there that I would urge you to just start Googling and to see what you like. There are so many helpful resources online for us as teachers. And so start there and see what you like and what you don't like. One thing that's very important as we talk about assessment, though, is that assessment needs to match instruction. So the assessment needs to be in the same format as the instructional activities, but with a different content. So your assessment shouldn't be a completely new format that they have never done before. So for example, with our writing objective, if you're assessing a student's ability to paraphrase, they need to have practiced paraphrasing with short texts of the same difficulty level. They should be very familiar with the format. So there shouldn't be surprises for them. Students should know exactly what to expect from the assessment. You can't use the same reading, or you can't use the same prompt for the text. It needs to be different, but it needs to be similar. But the format needs to be the same. And so that leads me to talk about what it is like for you in a teacher-centered environment. So some schools I know in Japan from my time there, some of you teachers don't have the freedom to have student-centered classrooms. And some of you are really under pressure to help them prepare for the entrance exam. We still need to create dynamic assessments to help prepare them for that. So while, the hope is that we have more dynamic student-centered classrooms that really help them think critically and learn how to use English well, the reality in Japan is that the entrance exam is still very crucial. So what should we do in that environment? So again, you have to ask, what's the objective? What do students need to be able to do well on the entrance exam? And then work backwards in that backwards planning. What class activities do you need to plan to prepare them for those tasks on the entrance exam? What assessments could you do in your class to help the students know how they're doing? How are the students doing with a listening task, which I believe is on the exam? Okay, so you go through the same process. And then you'll model the class activities after what they'll be expected to do on the entrance exam. Again, the question is, how will I know if they've met it? You need to break down the components of what they're being asked to do. And then they need feedback. The students need to know what they're doing well and what they're struggling with. So for example, I believe, I feel like the entrance exam is a big mystery to me in a lot of ways, but maybe a task is listening to a lecture and answering comprehension questions. So break it down. What do students need to be able to do for that? They need to be able to listen for key nouns, important people, dates, events, numbers. Maybe they need to understand transition words that signal time, connections, a result, therefore, things like that. And they need to be able to identify key points. So I'm going to build my class around that. I'm going to give them some sample lectures. I'm going to see how they do with comprehension questions. I'm going to look at the feedback that gives me about how they're doing with this task. And then I can give them feedback about, great, you are really understanding how to listen for people and dates, but you're missing those key points. So maybe we need to talk more about those transition words that help us see what the key ideas are. They need help with this. So even in a teacher-centered environment, we need to think critically about our assessments. Your situation dictates what kind of assessment and instruction you will conduct. Are you in a public school? Are you in a private school? Those are two very different situations. So your assessments, you might have more freedom than others, or not a lot of freedom based on where you are. What's the age group? Are you elementary, junior high, or high school? You need to think about that in terms of your assessments. And will students take the entrance exam? Are you preparing them for that? If so, keep that in mind. So some key points that I'd like to leave you with. The assessment must be tied to instruction. They can't be separate, they go together. The way you assess students can't be new to them. It can't be a brand new format for them. They need to be comfortable with that type of assessment. You need to use formative assessments to inform your teaching and your planning. Start with the objective and then go backwards. Plan your class, plan your assessments. And create rubrics that are efficient for you, but yet effective. And this is difficult with such large class sizes. So you really need to think about what's realistic. And then you must teach the rubric to the students so that they know what's expected and they know what they need to do to be successful in meeting the criteria. Okay, any questions? I do later on, if you see this on the website, I do have resources here that you can look at, but now it is time for questions. And so I ask that you use the Q&A box, please not the chat box, the Q&A box, and please put your questions in English. My Japanese is not very good, so please put those in English. It always takes a little bit of time for the questions to come in, so I'll give you some time. Any questions? I don't know if you have no questions or if it's just taking some time to write them down. Yes, I will go ahead and keep on my screen for a second the references. Someone asked for that. Okay, give you more detail about the exit ticket. Yeah, so this is something short and simple that you ask your students to respond to. So for example, if you are asking if your lesson was about the past tense, you could ask them a very simple question. Tell me what you did yesterday using 3 sentences. They write it down on a piece of paper, they put their name on it, they give it to you as they leave class. And so that tells you how they're doing with the past tense. You could do this with anything that you're talking about. Maybe you talked about a story and you want to know how they're understanding the story. Tell me who the main character of the story and what her problem was. What was the challenge she had in the story? And they could just write it down. It needs to be quick and simple. And then they answer it as they leave and give it to you. So then what you do after that is you use that information and maybe you start with that in your next class based on what students said. You say, okay, we're going to address this at the beginning of the next class because they're not understanding this or that. So an exit ticket is just one question or task, very simple and short, that they can do in the last 5 minutes of class before they leave. Do I think we should have a more formal assessment like term exams more often? It depends on your context. Summative assessments can serve a purpose. If that is what you need to do, if that works for your students, I don't know. I would err more on doing more formative assessments, but it depends on your context. So if that is what's needed, sometimes the more feedback more often is needed. So that's what formative assessments do. It gives us more regular feedback. So if you want to do more formal assessments more often, that could be a way to get more data. But tests are not very interactive. So if you have a student-centered class, if you are working more towards that for communication to understand if students are actually able to use English well, then I would err more on formative assessments like presentations, projects, and things like that. But again, it's completely up to you and your context. Thank you, Yumiko. What do you think is an appropriate average score out of 100 when we create an end of term assessment? When I became a teacher long ago, I learned it was 60, but now it seems too low because too difficult exams can demotivate students. Yeah, so I think for us here in my context in the United States, usually 75 is a good one. So a middle C. But like, that is something that you as a department in your school, you need to really talk about, because Japanese students are different than students that I work with in the United States. So I think if motivation is a serious factor for your particular students, then yeah, I would reconsider a score like 60. So that's a great conversation to have with your team. Okay. I teach a writing and grammar class, and when I check students' writing, I tend to check for perfect grammar. What is important and not so important in the grammar students use? Okay, so this is a great question. And for grammar, I think in Japan, the goal is perfection in a lot of ways, not just for grammar. And that's not attainable. Perfect grammar is very difficult to attain. And so because of that, it creates a lot of stress around grammar use. And when we are talking about grammar for communication, so when I was in Japan, I loved it when students were able to talk to me in English. Their conversation was usually full of grammar mistakes, but they were communicating with me, and it happened so rarely. And so I think that looking for perfect grammar really is a factor in demotivating students and keeping them from trying to speak or write and failing. Students need to be able to fail. And so I think not looking for perfection is very important. And so that's why I would say sometimes in your assessment to ask for grammar that doesn't impede understanding, or make it more accessible. So if you have been talking about how to write complex sentences with a semicolon, you're going to look for that. If you are talking about how to use the subjunctive, then maybe the only thing you look for in the assessment is the subjunctive. So be very specific about what you're looking for, and don't say, I want entire perfection in a writing. That's not realistic, and it really, I think, keeps students from communicating. And so that's the main goal, right? In Japan, you want your students to speak and write in English, and they're not, because they are terrified of making a mistake. So if there's one thing I could urge you all to do, is to stop looking for perfect grammar. I have friends that speak beautiful English. They write academic English. They're professional people, and they still make grammar mistakes, and that's okay. We're not looking for perfection. We're looking for communication. So that's what I would urge you there. Okay, when I do a speaking test for assessment, I always worry about if this test becomes just a memorizing test instead of doing comprehension test, because when I tell the kids about the topic, the kids often try to memorize what to say. Is there any effective way for the speaking test? I teach at a Japanese elementary school. Yeah, so if you tell them just about the topic, so you say, okay, tomorrow you're going to listen to a story about a girl who is playing in the park. I don't know what they'd be able to memorize from that. In your practice, in your class, you've listened to other stories before, and you model what you're looking for. So you're looking for key people, key places, key points. And so I don't know what kids can memorize from that, because you're asking them questions specific to a new story they're listening to. So again, you model and practice what you're doing ahead of time with other stories. And so they're not going to know the details of a story, but you can give them the topic, say, you know, it's about this. So they could start thinking about words that pertain to a park. So that's good practice. And they could practice speaking those words, but they're not going to know what you're going to ask. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. Okay, plagiarism. As for plagiarism, if the student uses it to make their writing more powerful and effective, I think I can accept it to some extent. I wonder how much you could admit it all right. I guess it depends on what is acceptable in Japan. If students are going to be abroad, plagiarism, when I teach students, because I teach international students, and many of them are from China, Asia, Japan included, plagiarism is really difficult, and it's something that we work a lot on. And so if they're going to work or be in an international environment, they cannot copy at all. It is a very serious offense in the United States, particularly. However, we do teach them how to quote. So using quotes, rarely, and small quotes are appropriate. They can't just quote long pieces of information, because sometimes you're right, if they use a quote, the original information is very important. But in terms of not quoting and just using information from the original source, if that's okay in Japan, that's one thing. But in terms of international standards, they can't do that if they're going to work and study abroad. So I think that depends on the context. Okay, so this is a great question. The exit ticket is a great idea, but Japanese students do not have enough vocabulary words immediately accessible. Would you consider some sentences with Japanese words in them? Sure. Another idea is to put, if they don't have much English, so on the board you could write a question and you could ask them for a one-word answer, or you could do a multiple choice and you want them to choose, put A, B, C, or D. So it doesn't have to be a written answer in full sentences. It could be any response that you think is appropriate for them. What the goal is that you want some indication of their learning from that day. So the exit ticket could be anything. It could be a multiple choice answer. It could be a one-word answer. It could be a Japanese answer if they're not, if they don't have vocabulary. The goal is, did you learn something? And so it depends on what you're asking. So you can be very flexible in what they do in response. Okay, I hope I answered about the exit ticket. How are we doing on time? In my school, we tend to give the exact same task that we have given as an assignment to the students. Yes, I saw that in Japan. So students have their corrected writing paper and they reproduce their writing for an exam. That's not an assessment. That's a reproduction. So that doesn't tell me whether they've learned anything. That tells me that they can copy something. And so, yeah, I saw that in Japan and I thought that was very interesting, because you can't give them the exact same task. That doesn't show me they've learned the skill. So I would urge you to reconsider that if you want to see if they've learned the skill itself. Yeah, is there any good assessment resources like pictures or writing topics on the web? Yes, there's a million. And so this is one thing that I want to urge teachers in Japan. There are resources, so many resources online that you could use to help you. And so, what I'm limited in what I can help you with because I don't know your situation. And so you know your situation, and so I can give you ideas, but there are a million more ideas online, and teachers are sharing their resources very freely online. And so there are blogs, there are places where you can download things for free. Sometimes you have to pay a small amount. There are a million resources on the web, so I would urge you to please look there. Another question about error correction on a writing task. Again, I would be very clear on your rubric what you're looking for. So if you're looking for correct sentence structure, put that on your rubric. If you're looking for correct articles, which I urge you not to do, put that on the rubric. Just be very specific in your rubric about what you're going to ask. Chiho, hi Chiho. Could you give us some more ideas for student-centered assessments? Yeah, so Flipgrid presentations would be great. Projects, portfolios would be a great assessment. A skit, a drama, a dialogue, anything, especially for Chiho, she's in a private school, so she has a little more flexibility. Anything that gets them to communicate. So presentations, projects, Flipgrids, things like that. They could even do a play, you know, anything that gets them producing the objective, the language that you want them to produce. Okay, I think we are out of time. Thank you so much for your questions. I'm sorry, I still had a couple left that I couldn't answer, but I hope that this was helpful for you. And this was, I know, just an introduction and just gave you a few ideas, and I hope that you will look online for more that will help you in your specific context. And I wish you the best of luck. Thank you for coming and have a good rest of your evening.